end of his consumer, you have to deliver for them. This channel, I remember my mother also died of cancer, lung cancer, and entertainment, Capri.
You know, I had a choice in that process of writing myself.
Registered with deep thoughts, but she has a loving heart.
Even with heresy.
Hello, Max Friedman. Welcome to the Bookaholic podcast.
Oh, wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for joining me today about a very important story, not only a part of your life, but the greater spectrum of world history. And today we're going to dive into the Holocaust from your personal perspective. And as I was talking to you on our pre-call and reading over your information, to start with, you said a phrase that I've never heard before. So let me explain. Of course, the true survivors, the main survivors of the Holocaust, many of them, there are not many of them left, as it were. And they're all transitioning to another life, another world. But you named yourself as a second generation Holocaust survivor. And I thought that was so interesting. I had never heard that phrase or anybody referencing it that way, until now. So, and it makes a lot of sense. Why do you name it that way?
Yeah. Well,
Why do you say second generation Holocaust survivor?
yeah. Well, first, again, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Until I started writing this book and researching this book, I actually had never heard that phrase before either.
Right.
I knew that our parents were survivors, and that was about it. And the point of the book was to try to bring a definition and a dimension to them that was beyond just their survival, because that's how I saw them, and other people saw them that way as well. But as I started to do this, I started to look at other children of survivors and books that they had written. And then it occurred to me that there were groups of people who were called Holocaust second generation survivors because, frankly, as I sort of defined it myself, we survived their survival in a sense. And we extended their survival into another generation when most of them basically lost their own first families. So we were their second families. And therefore, it made sense. It became something that actually I was proud of, and that actually I could find other people who were in my situation, because I had never really thought about it before. And frankly, I was so averse to even learning more until relatively recently, because growing up with them was just so painful.
Yes, I can see that. But also when I saw that phrase, I thought about this is a way for people to never forget the
Right,
Holocaust.
exactly.
And you, as a second generation Holocaust survivor, you have hopefully, if nothing else, some of the stories from the Holocaust. I know that was a very painful time. People of that generation are not the generation that freely expresses themselves. They kept themselves closed in, and then certainly traumatic events, they didn't want to talk about them. But that's how I saw that, as well as just
I
passing
think
down that.
you could see it that way, and I think that's true. We are left with a legacy of bringing their stories to the next generation and the generation after that as sort of a mission, so that, again, the idea of perhaps showing people what hate can do
Yes.
and how harmful it is at a grand and horrific level uh, is something that is our mission in a sense.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, as I was reading your story and you had shared some information about your parents, and let me see if I can find it really quickly. You were saying they were from Sweden. You were born in Sweden, by the way, but your parents were Polish Jews.
Right,
And they had liberation from Bergen-Belsen.
right.
Okay, so Bergen-Belsen, that's not one you hear about in history class too much. You hear about Auschwitz, you hear about the all the strongholds in Germany. Where is Bergen-Belsen? And
So Bergen-Belsen is actually in northern Germany. It's
okay,
sort of northeast, I guess it would be, not too far from the Baltic Sea. And it actually was originally a concentration camp for a small number of prisoners. There were about, I think, 7,000. It was built for about 7,000.
wow.
And what ended up happening is as the war progressed, others who were in other camps. So my mother was in Auschwitz
Mhm.
before
Oh,
Bergen-Belsen. My father was in a camp called Bunzlau, which was also not far from Dresden in
oh,
Germany as well. And when the Russians and the British and the Americans started moving into Germany and liberating the camps, uh, the Germans decided that they first wanted to extinguish the evidence of what they had done.
mhm.
And they also still needed laborers, slave laborers, even in that late 44, early 45 time. And so they
Mhm.
started moving prisoners from Auschwitz, from the camp my father was in, eastward, because everybody was coming from the west for the most part.
Right.
And so my father was put on a death march. It was
Mm.
called the Death March because not too many people survived. And he trekked with other prisoners from his camp for 6 weeks in the cold. It was probably the coldest winter. It was not global warming time. This was a very
Right.
cold time. It
Right. Right.
was
Right.
February of 1945, and he was on the road walking for 6 weeks through with about 400 other prisoners, and only very few survived. I think his group, there was about 70 who survived.
Mm.
And so it was again surviving after surviving for 3 years in the concentration camp. So this went
Mhm.
on and on. And they all went to Bergen-Belsen. So
Mhm.
Bergen-Belsen was by the time they got there, my mother got there earlier from
Mhm.
Auschwitz, but when they both got there, it was where Anne Frank died. Actually,
Oh.
Anne Frank and her sister died in Bergen-Belsen too.
Mm.
Uh, there were thousands upon thousands of prisoners there, and
Oh.
most of them were starving. Others were being killed regularly, and others had typhus. There was a tremendous rampant plague of typhus at that
Mm.
time, and many, including Anne Frank and her sister, died of typhus there.
Oh.
And so Belsen was sort of the last stand for these prisoners. There were thousands of, I describe it in the book, there are thousands of bodies were all over.
Mhm.
There was no one there to bury them. So I think when the British came in April of 45, uh, they found, I think, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 bodies just lying and on heaps from and so it was truly it was sort of the last images that my parents would see and would
Mhm.
experience, and
Mhm.
they were,
Mhm.
if it could be more horrible, they were more horrible than what they had seen even
Oh.
before. So that was Bergen-Belsen, and
Ooh.
the British liberated it in April 15th, 1945.
Wow. And just horrific.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, your parents, another interesting part of your history, you s- you say it that this is your parents' second family, that they both lost their first spouse
Right.
and their children.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I haven't, out of all the, and I'm sure that happened with different people, but out of all the Holocaust stories that I have seen on TV or in movies or read in books, that's the first time I ever heard that
Yeah.
some people, I guess it's just finally somebody, you framed it to where your parents were actually married to other people, had other family, other children, and they were all taken by the horrible Holocaust. And
Right.
then I guess your parents met.
Right.
So through the years, I mean, and I know again it was painful. Did they ever share anything with
Yeah.
you, such as, "Oh,
It
you had a sister," yeah, how did
right.
those conversations go? How did they
Yeah.
relate that
I,
information?
they weren't conversation. I guess they were monologues by them,
Ah,
in a sense. And my mother actually had a husband. She didn't have any children. My father had a wife and two little girls.
okay.
And my father never ever spoke about anything that happened before we were born. Nothing, nothing.
Ah,
And once, actually, in when I was 20 years old, so he never spoke about it. You could see that something very bad happened to him, but he never spoke about it. And when I was 20, and this was during the Vietnam War, and I got a bad lottery number. And even though I was in college, I was concerned about going to Vietnam.
right.
And so I told my father that I had read about a way to get a draft deferment, because by then they had run out of uh, soldiers and they were taking students who had gotten deferments because
Mhm,
students, and I was going to my senior year in college. And I
mhm.
told him that someone had told me that I could get a deferment
Right,
if they were emotionally dependent upon me for some
right,
reason.
right,
And I assumed that them losing everybody else in their lives and then potentially losing me would
right,
just put them over the edge, as if they weren't
right,
over the edge already.
right,
So I went to him and I said, "You really have to tell me something. You just have to tell me something about what happened to you."
right.
And he sat me down. We were on the beach, actually. We were living in Brighton Beach, which is
Okay.
southern Brooklyn.
Mhm.
And he sat me down and he talked to me for 20 minutes, only 20 minutes. And he
Okay.
told me about the last time he saw his first family.
Mhm.
So
Mm,
he had a wife and he had two
mhm,
little girls. And he told me that they were told to come to the village, to the square. They lived in a small village,
mhm.
and report. And this was in 1943.
Okay.
And they were in ghettos. He had been to slave labor camps, and he said that they were told to report with one suitcase with their whole families.
Mhm.
And he said they decided that this was not a good thing. Something
Right,
bad was going to happen. And so
right.
they went into hiding.
Okay.
They hid in an attic somewhere, he said.
Okay.
And then he went out to forage for food at night, just the first night that they were there. And in the second, when he came back, there was nothing. They were gone, and the children were gone. He had a 1.5-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Ugh.
And then he said, then they took him the next day.
Mhm.
And he didn't know what really happened to them, except that his wife had left the sweater. The only thing left in the attic was her sweater.
Mm.
And so he took that sweater and he went to concentration camps with that sweater in his hand.
Mhm.
And on
Mhm.
the death march that I just talked about at the very end
Mhm.
of the war, uh,
Mhm.
he carried that sweater with him. And somebody told him that they had seen his wife and children at Auschwitz, and that his wife his children were taken from his wife to go, theoretically, no one knew at the time they arrived at Auschwitz exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
But they went one place, and wife basically said, I have to go with them. So
Right.
this guy basically told him that he saw his wife and children on the line to go to the showers, which meant
Mhm.
going to the gas chambers.
Mm.
And that's how he found out that that was the end of his first family.
Wow.
And then and that was it. And in the book, what I tried to do was discover who they were actually.
Right.
And I discovered their names. I discovered when the
Mm.
girls were born, and I knew the date that they were killed, that they were murdered.
Yeah.
I had found all that out through my research, and I have to admit that when I found the names of the girls, uh, I couldn't stop crying because suddenly they became, in a sense, my sisters.
Yes.
And those were, and even now I sort of choke up.
Yes.
But suddenly, and I found that that's what was happening throughout my research, which was putting a name to somebody who had been killed
Right.
made a difference.
Right.
And it became more important for me to continue to the research to find out as much as I could and put it down on paper so that my family and others could see these people as human beings and not
Yes.
as another number of the 6 million.
Yes. Yes, most definitely. You know, Max, that what you just told me, I can't even explain how I felt when you were relaying that to me. You know,
Yeah.
it's a very, very emotional thing, and it just makes you wonder why people wanna dispel the fact or say, the Holocaust is not real and all of those type of things. It makes you kinda sick on the stomach. What do you say to those type of people?
Yeah. I think what has happened with the Holocaust deniers and what happened during the Nazi regime when all these people, for no reason apparently, were murdered, uh,
Yeah.
was that uh, their humanity had been taken away from them. And I think
Yes.
Holocaust survivors, I mean Holocaust deniers, and
Right.
people who still believe in the sort of racist ideology that that Nazism was, uh,
Right.
never were able to see these people not as human beings any longer.
Right.
There was a story when Joseph Mengele, who's called the Angel of Death,
Yes.
at Auschwitz, when people asked him after the war, because he actually survived and escaped to South America, uh,
Yes.
how could you select these children and everybody else to actually be murdered, these innocent people? And
Right.
he responded by basically saying, I didn't see them as people. To me, they were already dead. They were ghosts. So it wasn't hard for me to do experiments on them, which he did,
Right.
and to have them murdered because they weren't people any longer. And I think we come to a point when we are divided about political issues of one sort or another. And once we stop seeing our opponents, people who believe otherwise, not as human beings anymore, and as it's a matter of either I survive or you survive,
Right.
uh, then it changes the equation, and people do crazy, horrible things.
Yes, most definitely. It's kind of, you know, a little bit, and I don't want to compare pain for pain, but a little bit you see the same, some of the similarities, if you will, even though, well, how they began were two different comes from two different places. But you see that with slavery,
Hmm.
the people were
Exactly.
not recognized as human beings.
Right.
They were,
Exactly.
recognized as chattel,
Right.
and, you know, that's that same train of thought of hate that repeats itself, that
Yeah.
repeated itself during, the Holocaust, or
You're
really the whole
perfectly right.
time for Jewish people to along through history. It's the
Mhm.
same type of thing. And I don't see these people as people. So therefore, I can destroy their families. I can rip a baby out of a mother's arms and take that baby to Virginia and send the mother to Alabama.
Right.
So it was these horrific travesties try to repeat themselves. And as recently as just yesterday, there came out a story from the comic creator of Dilbert.
Mhm.
He was saying some horrible stuff, and getting things stirred up, and it's like, what do you think about all of this rise up of, like you said, these denying people, these hateful people? The whole anti-Semitism is just rearing its ugly head again. What can we do about that? What do you say about that?
I I mean, I just fear that we're not doing enough, this whole movement in education in some of the states. I think Florida is an example
Yes.
where
Yes.
where Black studies become
Right.
a political issue, and
Right.
and talking about slavery is something that we
Yeah.
don't do because it might upset somebody
Right.
uh,
Right. Right.
who because it's such a terrible story, and the Holocaust
Right.
stories are horrible to hear, but we
Right.
have to hear them. And for people to say that we can't teach that anymore, we have to teach that a certain way,
Right.
is the beginning of starting it all over again. Everything,
Yeah.
all these terrible things are just around the corner, just waiting.
Yes.
They're just
Yes.
sitting in a bottle, and there's a cork on the top of that bottle.
Yes.
And if we let the genie out, uh,
Yes.
and the only way we can let the genie out is by or keep it in,
Right.
is actually by opening up what the truth is,
Right.
and what the facts are. And this is not
Right.
something that can be disputed.
Right.
And there are a number of states that have Holocaust uh, curriculums that are required, but
Right.
a number of states don't. And
Right.
and I think the more, and particularly younger people who really, they're sort of living in their iPhones and living in TikTok and living in
Right.
places where
Right.
they can be influenced by all kinds of things.
Yes.
And one has to be careful, because it used to be fewer channels of communication and of information, and now they're everywhere, and some of them are horrible.
Yes.
And 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 at least if you can counter that in the school system, you have a chance. If you don't
Right.
do it in the schools or in the home,
Right.
it's sort of all over.
Yeah, it most definitely, and a lot of people would say, "Oh, what a bleak picture," but I do believe it is a true picture of what you're conveying. It's just extremely and very disturbing. Now, let's talk about. I thought this was very interesting. Your publisher, and your publisher is called Amsterdam Publishers.
Yes.
Yes, and can you tell the audience what's so very unique about Amsterdam Publishers?
Sure. Uh, this lovely lady named Lisbeth Henk, who is not Jewish,
Mhm,
uh, lives in a town in Holland,
mhm.
and was working for Sotheby's, and she's an art historian.
Okay,
And she looked around her about 10 or 12 years ago and said that, you know, something is wrong, that people don't know enough in Holland, in Amsterdam and areas like that. And they don't know enough about the Holocaust. And she just sort of put her mind to saying, I'm going to help them learn more. And she
yes,
started a publishing house that is for the last 10 years exclusively uh, publishing Holocaust related books. They can
Yes.
be fiction, they could be nonfiction, they can be, she's published recently a young adult written by a 16-year-old girl.
Right.
And it's wonderful. And I had a chance to be with about 40 of these of the authors at a gathering at the Dutch consulate in New York, and it was so uplifting to see them. They were all ages, from all backgrounds. Some were not Jewish, some were, many were. Some had survivors in their families, others maybe not. But
Right.
they all were dedicated to the idea, and Amsterdam Publishers dedicated to the idea of telling the story. And what we've told 40 people is 40 stories. And there are at least 6 million stories, if not more.
Right.
And so we have a long way to go.
Yes, most definitely. We certainly do. Max, thank you so much for joining me here today with this very important story, this very important information. Your book is called Painful Joy by Max Friedman, and we certainly will have your contact information and the book information and the podcast show notes, as well as in the video description box on YouTube. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.